3 men in sponsor jackets pointed at Cleat Harmon's truck and laughed loud enough for the bleachers to hear, and Cleat Harmon put his hand on the fender and did not move. That was the last Saturday of September 2003 at the Kearney County Truck and Tractor Pool in Minden, Nebraska. The bleachers held 381 people. The entry list had 14 trucks. 13 of them had been built or rebuilt in the last 8 years. One of them had not. If this story already has you, hit the like right now. You have no idea how much that single tap means to a channel like this one. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit that button below, because there's a new story every single week. Now tell me something while we're here. Did your father ever teach you something about machines? Something you still use today? Something he showed you with his hands? Not his words? Drop that in the comments. I read every single one. Now, let me tell you about the truck. It was a 1974 Peterbilt 359. It was the blue of something that had been outside for a generation. Not painted blue anymore, not exactly, but holding on to the memory of blue the way old things hold onto what they used to be. The hood had a long crease along the passenger side from a loading dock in 1988 that nobody ever bothered to straighten. The exhaust stack on the driver's side ran 2 inches lower than the other one because the mounting bracket had been replaced with a piece of 1/4-inch flat stock and 2 grade 8 bolts that Cleat had cut and drilled himself in 1996. The door on the driver's side said Farm Boy Racing in letters about 4 inches high, painted with a fence brush, black paint over the oxidized blue, slightly uneven on the descending letters of Racing because the door had been open and the wind had caught it just as he finished the G. 3 men stood 15 feet from that truck on the last Saturday of September 2003 and laughed. The one doing most of the talking was named Kyle Dressler. He was 31 years old. He ran a modified 2001 Peterbilt 379 with a Caterpillar 3406E that his father's transport company out of Kearney had spent somewhere between $60,000 and $80,000 turning into a pulling machine. That truck had placed second at the Nebraska State competition in Seward the previous June. Kyle Dressler had a jacket with 7 sponsor patches on it. He had a trailer to haul the truck to events. He had 2 crew members who traveled with him. He was pointing at Cleat Harmon's truck and laughing in a way that told you he had been doing well for long enough that he had forgotten what it felt like to not be doing well. "Old man," he said, "what class did you enter this thing in?" Cleat said, "Unlimited." That made Kyle Dressler laugh harder. His 2 crew members laughed with him, which is the thing crew members do. One of them said something about the door lettering. One of them said something about the exhaust stack. The one on the left said, "I wouldn't haul a dead hog in that thing," and thought that was pretty good. Cleat Harmon took his hand off the fender. He looked at the 3 of them for a moment. He said, "She'll pull." Then he walked around to the driver's side and climbed in. Here is what you need to understand before I tell you what happened that afternoon. Because the story of what happened at Minden in September 2003 is actually the story of 14 months that came before it. And 14 months before that is where this really starts. Cleat Harmon was born in 1932 in Phelps County, Nebraska, 3rd child of a man who broke 240 acres of shortgrass prairie in 1921 and spent the next 40 years turning it into something. His father was not a sentimental man. He was a man who fixed what broke and kept what worked and did not replace a thing until it could not be fixed any further. Cleat grew up in that philosophy, the way children grow up in languages. Not by being taught, but by breathing it. He took over the farm in 1961 when his father's back gave out. He married Carol Benson from Holdrege in 1964. They had 2 children, a son who died in 1971 from a fever that moved too fast, and a daughter named Lynn who now teaches high school chemistry in Holdrege and comes home most Sundays. Cleat never talks about the son. He never stopped farming. By 2001, Cleat Harmon was running 940 acres of corn and soybeans in Phelps County. Same land his grandfather broke. He had never sold a single parcel. He had refinanced twice, once in 1983 and once in 1993, both times because the margins on corn had gone negative, and the bank had wanted what banks want. He paid both notes off ahead of schedule. He owned his combine. He owned his planter. He owned his equipment. He did not allow a bank to hold a note on anything that harvested his crop. He was 69 years old in the summer of 2001 when he drove out to a diesel shop in Wilcox, Nebraska, 40 miles from Bertrand, down roads that take you through country flat enough to see weather coming from 2 states away. Because a man named Gerald Bauer had told him there was a 1974 Peterbilt 359 sitting behind that shop that the owner wanted off his property. The owner was a man named Darrell Hatch, who had inherited the truck from his brother and had no use for it and no ability to sell it because it had a cracked block. The block had cracked in the winter of 1997 during a cold snap that dropped the temperature in Phelps County to 22 below zero. The coolant had been low, not empty, just low, and something in the expansion of that near-frozen coolant had put a hairline fracture across the top of the right bank, cylinder 4 to cylinder 6, and by the time anyone found it, the damage was done. Darrell Hatch had gotten 2 estimates. The first was from a shop in Grand Island that wanted $14,000 to source and install a replacement block. The second was from a shop in Kearney that wanted $11,500 for the same job. Darrell Hatch had paid $9,200 for the truck from his brother's estate. He sold it to Cleat Harmon for $800 and a handshake. Cleat drove the 40 miles back to Bertrand with the truck on a flatbed borrowed from his neighbor Dale Schwitzer, and he put it in the equipment shed, and he looked at it for 3 days before he touched it. Now I need to stop here and explain something, because without understanding what was inside that hood, the rest of this story makes no sense at all. The engine in that 1974 Peterbilt was a Caterpillar 3406B, and the 3406B is the kind of engine that men who know engines speak about the way other people speak about things they consider close to sacred. The 3406 series was Cat's answer to a question the trucking industry was asking in the late 1960s. Can you build an inline 6-cylinder diesel that is powerful enough to move serious loads, reliable enough to run 1,000,000 miles, and simple enough to be repaired by a competent man with hand tools in the field? The 3406A came first in 1973. The 3406B followed with improvements to the cylinder head design, the camshaft timing, and the fuel injection system. It used mechanical injection, a pump and injector system driven directly off the engine, no electronics, no sensors, no computer of any kind making decisions about fuel delivery. You set the injection pump and it delivered fuel according to the position of your throttle and the physics of the system. That was all. The 3406B produced somewhere between 350 and 400 horsepower, depending on how it was set up. And more importantly, and this is the part that mattered on that Saturday in September, it produced torque. Real torque. Low-end torque. The kind that lives at the bottom of the RPM range and does not wait for the engine to spin up before it gets to work. At whopping 200 RPM, that engine was already making more than 1,400 foot-pounds of torque in a properly maintained and properly calibrated example. At 1,400 RPM, it was making more still. The power band on a 3406B is not a spike. It is a plateau. From 1,200 RPM to 1,600 RPM, the torque output barely moves. You are not chasing a peak. You are standing on it. But this engine had a cracked block. So Cleat Harmon got the service manual, which he had to order from a dealer in North Platte, because the manual that had been with the truck had been lost sometime in the late 1980s. He read it over the course of 1 week, in the evenings after the farm work was done, sitting at the kitchen table with Carol's coffee in a brown ceramic mug at his elbow. Then he called Eldon Starts in Wilcox, who ran the best independent diesel shop in that part of Nebraska at the time, and he told Eldon what he had and what he wanted to know. Eldon drove out and looked at the block for 45 minutes without saying anything. Then he told Cleat the fracture had not propagated into the water jacket and had not touched the main bearing saddles. He said the block, in his opinion, could be sleeved, that individual cylinders could have new liners pressed in, wet sleeves, which would restore the sealing surface and eliminate the cracked material from the structural equation entirely. Eldon said he would not recommend it for a working haul truck that was going to see 80,000-mile years. He said for what Cleat appeared to have in mind. It was sound. Cleat said, "What do I owe you?" Eldon said, "You got any good corn this year?" That was the extent of the consultation. Cleat pulled the engine himself, using a borrowed engine hoist from Dale Schwitzer and a come-along he had owned since 1974. He disassembled it on a workbench made from 2-inch oak planks over a steel frame that he had built in 1969 and never needed to rebuild. He identified the cracked cylinders, 4, 5, and 6 on the right bank, with 4 being the worst. He drove the engine block to Eldon Starts in Wilcox, and Eldon's shop pressed new wet sleeves into all 6 cylinders on the right bank. Not just the damaged ones, because if you're going to do it, you do it right. The cost of that machine work was $1,840. While the block was in Wilcox, Cleat replaced every bearing: main bearings, rod bearings, thrust washers. He measured each journal with a micrometer. He had owned the micrometer since 1971, a Starrett still in its original case, and found 3 rod journals that were at the low end of spec. He had them ground in Grand Island, which cost $220, and installed undersized bearings to match. Then he did something that Darrell Hatch had not done, and probably nobody had done to that engine in years. He had the injection pump recalibrated. The injection pump on a 3406B is the heart of the fuel system. It is a mechanical device, gear-driven off the camshaft, and it meters fuel to each injector based on throttle position and engine speed. When it is set at the factory, it is set conservatively, because the factory has to account for the full range of conditions the engine will see in service, including marginal fuel quality, high altitude, extreme temperatures, and operators who do not maintain their equipment. The factory setting leaves margin on the table, deliberate margin. Eldon Starts had a calibration bench. It was an old Sun bench, the kind that shops bought in the 1970s and never needed to replace because they built things to last back then. Eldon put the injection pump on that bench and ran it through its range, measuring delivery at each set point. He found that the pump was delivering conservatively at the upper end of the throttle range, not because it was worn, but because that was how it had always been set. He advanced the timing by 2 degrees and increased the maximum fuel delivery to the upper end of what the 3406B specification allowed, not beyond, to the upper end. That change, alone, was worth somewhere between 80 and 120 foot-pounds of additional torque at the peak, on top of an engine that had just been rebuilt with new sleeves, new bearings, and new seals throughout. But Cleat was not finished. The turbocharger on the original engine was a Schwitzer unit that had probably been replaced once in the truck's working life and was now showing end play in the shaft, a sign that the thrust bearing was worn. Cleat sourced a rebuilt unit from a truck parts dealer in Lexington for $340. The rebuilt unit was not stock. It was a larger housing version designed for the 3406C, which ran slightly higher boost pressure than the B. The housings were compatible. The increase in boost pressure at peak load was measurable, somewhere in the range of 2 to 3 pounds per square inch more than the stock turbo produced. That additional boost fed more air into the cylinders. More air meant more fuel could burn completely. More complete combustion meant more torque. When Cleat reinstalled the engine, he also replaced the transmission. The original gearbox in the Pete had been a 10-speed Eaton Fuller that was worn enough in the shift collars and detent grooves to make it difficult to float gears cleanly under load. You had to double-clutch every split or risk hunting between positions. He sourced an Eaton Fuller RTLO 2613. a 13-speed direct-control road ranger with a 2-speed auxiliary and top-gear overdrive, the kind of gearbox that gave a driver 13 distinct ratios to find exactly where the engine wanted to live. From a wrecked 1979 Peterbilt that a salvage yard in Broken Bow was parting out. The purchase price was $420. The 13-speed gave Cleat 2 additional split gears in the upper range, which meant he could keep the engine at its peak torque output more precisely during a pull. He could split gears to hold 300 RPM instead of being forced to choose between 100 and 500. That precision mattered. It was the difference between lugging the engine below its power band and staying on the flat top of the torque curve where the 3406B did its best work. Eldon Starts installed the transmission in February 2002 in his shop in Wilcox on a Tuesday morning that was cold enough to make the shop floor feel like standing on ice. Cost of labor, $380. Eldon also replaced the drive shaft with a Spicer 1810 series heavy-duty unit that he had in the back of his shop from a job 2 years prior. He charged Cleat $140 for it. Said the original shaft had a slight runout that would have wasted power and been felt in the cab under heavy load. The total cost of the build, when Cleat added it up on a notepad in March of 2002, was $12,300. That included the truck, the machine work, the parts, Eldon's labor, the fuel to haul the truck to Wilcox and back, and 2 new 10-ply commercial tires for the drives that Cleat bought at a truck stop in Lexington because the originals were cracked at the sidewall. Used tires, but sound. $60 each. He drove the truck back to Bertrand in March of 2002 and parked it in the equipment shed next to the combine. He did not enter it in anything that season. He used it to haul grain during harvest, corn and soybeans, the same loads it would have pulled 40 years earlier, and he listened to it. He learned where the power lived. He learned the gear sequence in the 13-speed well enough that his hand moved without his thinking about it. He learned how the rebuilt turbo came in, slightly later than the original, a longer spool, but then with more pressure than he had ever felt in a truck that size. Carol brought him a sandwich at 6 p.m. on the evenings he was working late. 2 taps on the shoulder. She went back to the house. She did not ask what he was planning. She had been married to him for 38 years. Lynn came home on a Sunday in October 2002 and walked out to the equipment shed with a cup of coffee and watched her father back the truck to the grain auger and load a 32-ton set of wagons in one pull without the engine dropping below 100 RPM. She said, "Dad," he said, "she'll pull." Lynn went back inside and drank her coffee. Gerald Bauer heard about the truck in the spring of 2003. Cleat did not tell him. Gerald heard it from Dale Schwitzer, who had loaned Cleat the engine hoist and had watched him work. Gerald Bauer drove 90 minutes from his place south of Oxford on a Thursday afternoon to look at it. He was 64 years old, had been pulling trucks competitively across Nebraska since the early 1980s, and he looked at that rebuilt Pete for a long time without saying much. Then he looked at the door lettering. He said, "Farm Boy Racing." Cleat said, "Fence brush." Gerald said, "You entering this somewhere?" Cleat said, "Mainden, September." Gerald said, "I'll be there." He drove 90 minutes back home without saying anything else that mattered. The morning of the last Saturday of September 2003 was cold enough to see your breath. Cleat had the Pete on the road by 5:30, running down the highway toward Minden with the heater on and the radio off. He had loaded the truck the night before with the tools he might need: a set of combination wrenches, a timing light, a fuel pressure gauge, a spare set of injector hold-down bolts in a coffee can, and 2 quarts of oil in a paper bag on the passenger seat. He pulled into the Minden Fairgrounds at 7:15 and drove the Pete to the staging area. He parked it, walked around it once, and checked the oil. The oil was fine. By 8 o'clock, the other trucks were arriving. Kyle Dressler's modified 2001 Peterbilt came on a gooseneck trailer pulled by a late-model pickup with a 5th-wheel hitch. The Pete came off the trailer, and Kyle's 2 crew members went to work immediately, checking tire pressures with a digital gauge, reviewing something on a laptop that was connected to the truck's diagnostic port, adjusting something on the intercooler, piping with a wrench that had a ratcheting head. There were also a modified 1998 Kenworth W900 with a Detroit Series 60 that had been built out by a shop in Columbus, Nebraska, specifically for pulling events. A 1996 International 99900 with an unknown engine that was reportedly making somewhere north of 700 horsepower. A 2000 Freightliner Classic with a C-15 Cat that had been tuned beyond anything Caterpillar would have considered sanctioned. These were serious trucks built by people who took this seriously. And then there was Cleat Harmon's 1974 Peterbilt 359. The blue of something that had been outside for a generation, with a fence brush on the door and a 15-year-old rebuilt Eaton Fuller in the driveline, and a man who was 71 years old and had gotten up at 4 in the morning to get here. That is when Kyle Dressler walked over. You already know what was said. The laughing, the pointing. I wouldn't haul a dead hog in that thing. The crew members who laughed because that was their job. What you did not see from the bleachers. And there were 381 people in those bleachers by 9 o'clock, a better turnout than the previous year, partly because word had gotten around about the old Pete from Bertrand. What you did not see was a boy of about 12 standing at the fence near the staging area. He was somebody's son. He had a program in his hand, with the entry list on it. He was looking at Cleat's truck the way 12-year-old boys look at things they are trying to understand. He said, "Mister, why is your truck so old?" Cleat said, 1974. The boy said, "Why didn't you get a newer one?" Cleat looked at the truck for a moment. He said, "Because the ground don't lie. Dirt doesn't care what something cost. It just tells you what it is." The boy thought about that. He wrote something in the margin of his program. The pull started at 10 o'clock. The format was straightforward. Each truck would pull the weighted sled down the track, which was 300 feet of packed dirt. The sled worked on a weight transfer principle. As it moved forward, a ballast weight shifted toward the front of the sled, progressively increasing the load on the skid plate that dragged against the ground. A truck that pulled the sled the full 300 feet was said to have pulled a full pull. If multiple trucks achieved full pulls, they pulled again with additional weight added to the sled. The winner was the truck that moved the sled the furthest against the heaviest final weight. The first 4 trucks pulled in sequence. The modified 1998 Kenworth with the Series 60 achieved a full pull on its first attempt. The 1996 International stopped at 247 feet. Strong, but not a full pull. The 2000 Freightliner Classic also achieved a full pull. Kyle Dressler's 2001 Peterbilt went third in the main rotation and pulled the full 300 feet, and then kept pulling past the line, which was the kind of thing you do when you want the crowd to notice, and the crowd noticed. Cleat Harmon was 9th in the rotation. He climbed up into the cab of the Pete at 9:50, started the engine, and let it idle for 10 minutes. The 3406B came to life the way old engines come to life. Rough at first, like something working through a long sleep, the mechanical injection system cycling through its sequence before the combustion settled into something even and controlled. By the time it had run for 5 minutes, it was breathing steadily, the exhaust note settling into a low and even pulse that you felt in your chest more than you heard with your ears. The track official signaled him forward at 10:47. Now I need you to understand something about the physics of what was about to happen. Because this is where the story turns, and it turns because of something that most people, even people who know trucks, get backwards. When Kyle Dressler's 2001 Peterbilt with the modified 3406E made its full pull, it did so by making a lot of power. The 3406E in that truck was reportedly producing somewhere in the neighborhood of 600 horsepower, which is not far from what some of the lighter aircraft of World War II produced. That is a real number. It is an impressive number. And it pulled that sled down 300 feet with authority, with black smoke rolling off the stacks, the way it does when a diesel is pushing fuel hard, with the crowd on its feet. But here is what horsepower does and does not do. Horsepower is a rate. It is work per unit of time. It tells you how fast a machine can do something. Torque is force. It tells you how hard a machine can push or pull at any given moment. In a truck pull, you're moving a sled that starts heavy and gets heavier. The question is not how fast the truck can do work. The question is whether the truck can produce enough force to move the sled at all, and then whether it can keep producing that force as the load increases. Kyle Dressler's 3406E made 600 horsepower at somewhere around 1,800 RPM. That is where the engine was designed to produce its peak power. The torque on a 3406E is substantial, something in the range of 1,650 to 1,800 foot-pounds at peak. But the peak torque on that engine, in the state of tune it was in for competition, came up at around 1,400 to 1,600 RPM. Below that range, the engine was making less. Cleat Harmon's 3406B, in its current configuration, was producing an estimated 1,150 foot-pounds of torque at 1,200 RPM. That number is not a typo. At 1,200 RPM, a speed so low that most drivers would feel their engine was close to lugging, Cleat's engine was making maximum force. It was fully loaded, fully on cam, fully in its power band, because Eldon Starts had calibrated that injection pump to deliver maximum fuel at precisely that point in the RPM range, because the larger turbo housing was moving enough air at that speed to support complete combustion, because the 13-speed transmission gave Cleat the ability to hold 1,200 RPM in the gear, where that torque did the most work on the sled. Most of the other competitors were letting their engines wind up. They were accelerating toward the sled hookup, trying to build momentum and engine speed simultaneously, so that by the time the chain came tight, they were already at the RPM where their engines made their best power. That strategy works. It worked for Kyle Dressler. It worked for the Kenworth and the Freightliner. Cleat Harmon pulled to the hook at idle. He did not accelerate into the hookup. He engaged the chain at walking speed, let the slack come out, and when the chain came tight, he was already in the gear he intended to finish in. He moved the throttle to the floor in one steady motion. The 3406B did not howl. It did not scream. It did not produce the kind of explosive crack that the crowd had heard from the high-horsepower engines earlier in the day. It produced a sound that was lower than any of that. A deep, sustained, rolling note that the people in the bleachers felt in their sternums before they registered it as sound. Like a thing that was not going to hurry because it did not need to hurry, because it already knew exactly how strong it was. The sled began to move. At 50 feet, the weight had transferred far enough forward that the load on the skid plate was equivalent to what had stopped the International 9900 at 247 feet on its best run. The peat kept pulling. At 100 feet, Kyle Dressler had stopped talking to his crew members. He was watching. At 150 feet, the crowd in the bleachers was on its feet. Not all of them, not yet, but enough of them that the sound from the stands had changed. The 381 people who had paid $8 each to watch trucks pull a weighted sled down 300 feet of packed Nebraska dirt were no longer watching other trucks. They were watching this one. At 200 feet, the track official was holding his clipboard so hard his knuckles were white. He had been running pulls for 11 years. He had never seen a mechanical injection 3406B from 1974 at 200 feet against that sled weight. At 250 feet, the exhaust stacks were running black and dense, rolling a thick column of smoke that hung in the cold September air. The engine was lugging. It was right at the bottom of its RPM range, fighting the maximum load transfer the sled could produce, and it was not stopping. That is what a flat torque curve does. When a high-revving engine hits the bottom of its power band, there is nothing there. The curve falls off. When Cleat's engine hit the bottom of its RPM range, the torque curve was still flat. There was still 1,400 foot-pounds where he was working. There was still force. At 300 feet, the sled crossed the mark. Full pull. The crowd made a sound that you do not hear at every pull. It was not polite applause. It was not the organized cheer that comes when the hometown truck does something expected. It was the unorganized sound of 381 people processing something they had not believed was going to happen. Cleat pulled through the mark, coasted to a stop, disengaged the chain, and drove the Pete back to the staging area. He climbed down from the cab. He walked to the front of the truck. He checked the oil. Gerald Bauer was at the fence. He said nothing. He tilted his chin once. Cleat went back to checking the tires. There were 3 trucks left to run in the original rotation, and 2 of them achieved full pulls, which meant there would be a runoff, with additional weight on the sled. Cleat's Pete, Kyle Dressler's modified Peterbilt, the Kenworth with the Series 60, and the Freightliner Classic. 4 trucks, 1 more run each. The added weight brought the starting load up significantly. The track official estimated the equivalent of an additional 4 tons of resistance at the beginning of the pull, before any transfer had occurred. At that level, the sled required not just peak torque, but sustained torque, because the load was now enough that even a momentary dip in force would stop the sled's momentum, and you would not get it back. The Kenworth went first in the runoff. It went 281 feet. Strong, not a full pull. The Freightliner went second. It went 263 feet. The C-15 had run hard in the first pull and was running slightly soft in the second. The crew suspected a wastegate issue but couldn't confirm it without tools they hadn't brought. Kyle Dressler went third. He did everything right. His crew had made 2 adjustments to the truck between runs. They had increased boost pressure by adjusting the wastegate on the turbo, a procedure that required a laptop in about 4 minutes, and they had changed the rear tire pressure to optimize traction on the track surface as it had dried out through the morning. His 3406E wound up perfectly, hit the hook at the right RPM, and pulled with everything it had. He went 294 feet, 6 feet short of a full pull. The crowd was quiet in a particular way when his sled stopped, the quiet of a crowd watching arithmetic they don't want to do. 6 feet short, against a weight that had stopped the Kenworth and the Freightliner, 6 feet. Kyle Dressler stepped down from his cab and stood with his arms crossed and looked at the track. Cleat Harmon drove the Pete to the hook. He did not change anything between runs. He had not made any adjustments to the truck during the break. He had drunk half a cup of coffee from a thermos Carol had packed, and he had eaten the sandwich she had wrapped in wax paper and put in the bag with the coffee. 2 hours earlier, she had made that sandwich in their kitchen in Bertrand, 40 miles away, before he left in the dark. He had not called her. He would call her when he got home. He pulled to the hook at the same walking pace as the first run. Let the slack out. Engaged the load. The 3406B found its torque at 1200 RPM exactly as it had before. Here is what nobody in those bleachers knew, and what I want you to know. The second run was harder than the first. The added weight on the sled meant that the force required to sustain momentum was higher throughout the entire pull. At the point where the first run had taken everything the engine had, the second run was asking for more. At 200 feet in the second run, the engine was running lower than it had in the first. The exhaust was heavier. The note from the stacks had dropped half a register, the way a voice drops when it is doing the hardest work it will ever do. At 250 feet, the right side exhaust stack, the one 2 inches lower than the other one, held up by the piece of flat stock and the 2 grade 8 bolts Cleat had cut and drilled in 1996, was pouring a column of smoke so dense it was nearly black, casting a shadow on the track surface in the morning light. At 270 feet, the track official said something to his assistant that nobody heard because the engine was too loud. At 290 feet, 4 feet past where Kyle Dressler's truck had stopped, the sled was still moving. At 300 feet, the mark passed under the sled's skid plate, and the track official's flag went up, and 381 people in a set of bleachers in Minden, Nebraska, made a sound that Gerald Bauer, who had been at truck pulls in this state for 20 years, said he had never heard before. Full pull. Cleat let the chain go slack, drove the Pete to the side of the track, climbed down. Kyle Dressler was standing where he had been standing since his run ended. He was not pointing at anything. He was not saying anything. He was looking at the Pete. After a long moment, he looked at Cleat. Then he looked back at the truck. He said, "What did you do to that 3406? Cleat said, "Recalibrated the pump, bigger turbo housing." Kyle said, "How much you got in it?" Cleat said, 12,003. Kyle Dressler was quiet for a while. Then he said, "He took care of his stuff." He walked back to his truck. That was the last thing Kyle Dressler said to Cleat Harmon that day, or any day after. The boy at the fence, the 12-year-old with the program, had written something in the margin during the first pull. After the second pull, he pushed through to the staging area in a way that 12-year-olds do when they have decided something matters. He came up to Cleat while Cleat was checking the tire on the right rear drive axle. He said, "How did you know it was going to work?" Cleat straightened up. He looked at the boy. He said, "Because the ground don't lie. Dirt doesn't care what something cost. It just tells you what it is." The boy looked at the tire. Then he looked at the truck. Then he looked at Cleat. He said, "Yes, sir." The way 12-year-old boys say it when they have understood something they will not be able to explain for another 30 years. Gerald Bauer found Cleat at the truck 40 minutes later, after the crowd had mostly cleared out and the other rigs were loading onto their trailers. Gerald had a cup of coffee from the concession stand. He handed it to Cleat without being asked. Cleat took it. Gerald said, "You entering this anywhere else?" Cleat said, "Maybe Seward in June." Gerald said, "I'll tell some people." Cleat said, "Don't tell too many." Gerald smiled and walked back to his truck. Carol made pot roast that evening. Lynn called from Holdrigger at 7. Cleat told her the truck had done all right. Lynn said, "I didn't doubt it." Cleat said, "I know." They talked for 12 minutes about other things. The chemistry curriculum, the soybean prices, the way the fall had come in dry this year, and what that meant for the next planting season. After they hung up, Cleat went back out to the equipment shed. He turned the light on and stood in front of the Pete for a while. The oxidized blue paint held the light the way old things hold what they've been given. He checked the oil one more time. It was fine. He turned off the light and went back inside. The 1974 Peterbilt 359 with the Caterpillar 3406B, the Eaton Fuller RTLO 7613 13-speed, the Spicer 1810 driveshaft, and the fence brush door lettering that reads Farm Boy Racing is still in Bertrand, Nebraska. It still runs. Cleat Harmon is 91 years old. He still farms 940 acres in Phelps County on the land his grandfather broke in 1921. He has not sold a single parcel. The ground doesn't lie. Dirt doesn't care what something cost. It just tells you what it is. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you know a story like this one, a machine that outlasted what everyone said about it, a man who understood something everyone else missed, leave it in the comments. I read every single one.